Welcome to the War Academy channel. The Second World War, how could it be otherwise, has left us many anecdotes and curiosities, one of the most striking being the use of searchlights by the Soviets during the Battle of the Seelow Hills. This improvised strategy is added to many others that, due to the specific needs of the moment, they decided to use. As the famous phrase that is now a meme says, although in Zhukov's head this idea was spectacular, during practice it was disastrous. But, what was it that led the Soviet commanders to use these reflectors? Why did they launch the attack during the hours of darkness? What was the reason that they had to attack with such power and speed? And finally, why did its use have such poor results? Next, and during this program, we will solve it. Before we get into the issue that brings us to this video, let's get into a position to understand why this latest offensive near the Seelow was so special. If we look at any Soviet offensive, whether it be the one launched in December 1941, the Stalingrad offensive in November 1942, the offensives north and south of the Kursk salient in 1943, or those launched during Operation Bagration in 1944, they all have something in common. This characteristic that they all share is their element of surprise, and the length of the attack fronts. And it is that in all of them, the Germans were to a greater or lesser extent surprised by the Soviets, who always knew how to play their cards very well. However, all this would change when they had to face their last offensive on Berlin. At this point in April 1945, the Germans knew exactly where the Soviets were going to attack. This is because the front line had been reduced to a minimum, and because to get to Berlin, they had to break through the defenses they had prepared along the Oder, yes. This being the situation, Zhukov needed to surprise the Germans in some way, and based on this need, this idea arose. It was specifically during April 5 and 7, when numerous meetings were held between the different Soviet commanders in the area, to study the operation in detail. It determined the following. In the first place, since they knew that the Germans knew perfectly well what the Soviet intentions were and where they would attack, since they were forced to charge head-on on Berlin, they had to generate some kind of situation that would give them an advantage, since they could not count on surprise. The conclusion they reached was that an attack should be made as forceful as possible, which would stun and shake the German defensive foundations. For this, aviation, artillery and tanks would be used en masse, with the aim of creating a concentration of fire never seen before, which would completely devastate the Germans. Even though it was evident that the offensive was imminent in that sector, the utmost care was taken to camouflage all the preparations and not reveal them until the last moment. Second, they discussed the need to change their attack strategy. Although the Soviets had been characterized by carrying out heavy artillery barrages early in the day, to later launch their breakthrough ground attack, this was something that had to change. The solution to surprise the Germans would be not to wait until dawn to start their attack, because instead, they were going to attack them during the night. With this they hoped to completely surprise them, and generate great confusion and panic among the German ranks. The new idea would be, therefore, to carry out the artillery attack during the night of April 16, and to attack with the infantry before sunrise. As we saw in the program on the characteristics of the Eastern Front, it was common for infiltration missions to take place between German lines at night, as well as minor combat, but a night offensive of such magnitude had never been considered. Thus, with the aim of supporting the infantry attack, the idea was to use some 140 anti-aircraft searchlights that, instead of pointing to the sky, would be tilted in the direction of the German ground positions. This idea seemed spectacular in the heads of those men, and all were in favor of its use when it came time for the vote. In addition to giving his troops vision at night, these lights were also intended to intimidate, confuse, and blind the Germans, so that they would almost run from their positions and flee the battlefield. So therefore, we can conclude that due to these reasons, and based on these objectives, this measure was approved. 2 days before the main attack, Zhukov made a series of scores along the line using more than 30 infantry battalions, which were to make the Germans believe that the Soviet offensive had already begun. With this it was intended that the German reserves were sent to the front line and thus be able to destroy them with the enormous artillery attack. However, this hook attempt did not go well, because after capturing numerous Soviets who were carrying out this mission, the Germans learned that the main attack was going to take place during the early hours of April 16th. This artillery barrage on the German lines began around 2 in the morning, and some 22,000 artillery pieces participated in it, firing for approximately an hour and a half. Once the Soviet artillery fire ceased, the sky lit up with thousands of flares that were launched in succession. It was here too that the 140 searchlights were turned on in a line, at a distance of 200 meters from each other. In Zhukov's own words, "The painting made an immense impression, and perhaps I will not remember such a sight in all my life." However, the dust and smoke in suspension raised by the powerful artillery barrage was so dense that even the powerful searchlights could not penetrate it. This, to give us an idea, generated a situation similar to turning on the high beams of the car when there is intense fog on the road. The result is that everything lights up without actually seeing anything. In a practical way, these lights completely blinded the Soviets rather than the Germans and prevented them from looking back. As if they were donkeys with visors on the sides, they could only look towards the German lines, if they did not want to be the ones who were stunned. Because during this final phase of the war, many soldiers were trying to sneak away so as not to die or be crippled for life right at the end. Some thought that the idea of the searchlights was to prevent them from retreating themselves. Finally, far from stunning, intimidating the Germans, or lighting the way for the Soviet troops, this measure ended up favoring the defenders, indicating the silhouette of their enemies and making it easier for them to target. Once the offensive began, and the front-line battalion commanders saw that these searchlights were causing more damage among their ranks than among the Germans, they tried to turn them off, but the order was quickly cancelled and they were turned on again. It can be concluded, therefore, that Zhukov's intention to overwhelm and stun his enemy ended up going in the worst possible way, and paradoxically, all the measures he used to quickly bypass the German defenses turned against him. And it is that if military history has taught us something, it is that many times the massive use of brute force is not the best solution to apply on the battlefield, to which if you add the rush, they make a perfect combination so that everything goes wrong. In any case, and as a military maxim says, which is how the Germans were able to experiment in so many operations, no matter how good your ideas and approaches are, you have to keep in mind that the enemy also plays. Well, I hope that with this explanation taken directly from Marshal Zhukov's memoirs, everyone has been able to understand the reason for the significant action that occurred in the last great battle on the Eastern Front, before the Soviets entered Berlin. And it is that although many times this idea is sold as a whim of the Soviet Marshal, in his intention to surprise and overwhelm his enemy, it could make a lot of sense. And what do you think? Do you consider that given the circumstances, another strategy could have been applied to try to surprise the Germans? Do you think the idea of the night attack is a good one? If you want to expand the theme of this last battle, I leave you in the description the links to different gatherings that we have made on the subject, along with the references of Zhukov's memoirs, from where we have mainly obtained the information for this video. And finally, this is the end of the video. Thank you all very much, especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and see you in the next one. See you soon.